The autumn fog wrapped around Vienna's Ringstrasse like a silk scarf, softening the sharp edges of the imperial capital's grandest boulevard. Gas lamps flickered to life along the 5-kilometer ring, their golden halos illuminating the monumental facades of the Opera House, Parliament, and City Hall. Carriages clattered over limestone pavement, their wheels creating a rhythmic percussion that echoed off the historicist buildings. It was October 1885, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire's aristocracy was in its gilded prime. Alexander von Rothenburg stood before the tall mirror in his family's residence, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted his ascot. The young man of 19 years possessed striking green eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond his age, and dark brown hair swept back in the aristocratic Viennese fashion. His tailored navy casaca fit his elegant frame perfectly, the embroidered vest beneath it a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Everything about him spoke of refinement and noble breeding except for the scar. The burn stretched from his right temple to his cheekbone, the skin textured and pale against his otherwise clear complexion. It was a permanent reminder of the fire that had consumed part of the stables when he was 7 years old. He'd rushed in to save his beloved horse, and though he'd succeeded, the flames had left their mark. 12 years later, that mark defined how society saw him. Alexander, his father's voice came from the doorway. Leopold von Rothenburg, 48 years old with graying temples and warm brown eyes, entered with the protective concern that had become habitual. "You don't have to attend today's gathering at Stat Park. Your mother and I could make your excuses." Alexander turned from the mirror, straightening his posture with practiced dignity. "Father, I cannot hide forever. The von Rothenburg name deserves representation, and I am your heir." His voice carried a quiet strength that belied his inner turmoil. Leopold approached, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Your character is worth 1,000 unblemished faces, my boy. I only wish others could see what I see, a young man of remarkable compassion and extraordinary talent. Thank you, father." Alexander managed a small smile, but in Vienna's salons compassion counts for little when weighed against appearances. The carriage ride to Stat Park was brief, but felt eternal. Alexander watched the city pass by, the impeccable facades, the fashionable crowds, the rigid hierarchy made visible in every interaction. He knew his place in this world, the edge of acceptability, always observed, rarely welcomed. Stat Park stretched before them in geometric perfection. Formal gardens bloomed with late-season flowers, their colors muted in the diffused autumn light. Ornate fountains sent arcs of water into the air, and marble sculptures of Vienna's greatest composers gazed eternally over the manicured paths. Iron benches with golden details dotted the walkways, where aristocratic families gathered for carefully orchestrated casual encounters. Alexander walked beside his father along the gravel paths, acutely aware of the glances that followed him. Some were curious, others pitying, and worst of all were those filled with barely concealed revulsion. He'd learned to keep his scarred side slightly turned away, a defensive habit that had become second nature. Well, if it isn't the monster of Rothenburg." A voice cut through the autumn air like a blade. Alexander's heart sank. He knew that voice, smooth, cultured, and dripping with cruelty. Maximilian von Steinhardt emerged from behind a sculptured hedge, flanked by 3 young aristocrats who served as his perpetual audience. At 21, Maximilian was everything Alexander was not: tall, athletic, with platinum blonde hair and ice-blue eyes set in a face of perfect symmetry. His impeccable frock coat and silk vest probably cost more than most families earned in a year. "Maximilian," Leopold said tersely, positioning himself slightly in front of his son. "Good afternoon." Count Rothenburg. Maximilian nodded with exaggerated politeness, his gaze sliding past Leopold to fix on Alexander. "And young Alexander, tell me, have you been frightening children again? I heard the nanny at the Hofburg Palace had to comfort little Archduchess Marie after she saw you at the opera last week." The young men behind Maximilian snickered. Alexander felt heat rising to his face, the unmarred side flushing while the scarred tissue remained pale. "That's enough," Leopold said, his voice hard as granite. "Oh, forgive me, Count, I forget how sensitive the topic is." Maximilian stepped closer, and Alexander caught the scent of expensive cologne and smugness. "It's just that we have standards to maintain in Viennese society. When someone's appearance might disturb the sensibilities of our finest families, he let the sentence hang, shrugging with affected sympathy. Alexander found his voice, though it came out quieter than he intended. "My appearance is the result of courage, not character failure. I saved a living creature from flames." "What have you ever sacrificed for anything beyond your own vanity?" For a moment something dark flashed in Maximilian's perfect blue eyes, not anger, but something deeper: envy. Perhaps. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. Courage? Maximilian laughed, the sound like breaking glass. You call it courage. I call it the act of a foolish child who now bears the consequences of his stupidity for all to see. At least a horse would have been useful. You're merely decorative. In a cautionary sort of way, that's quite enough. Leopold's hand moved to the walking stick he carried, not as ornament but as potential weapon. Family to their walk. The air seems to have grown rather thick here as they departed. One of Maximilian's companions looked back with what might have been genuine discomfort, but he said nothing. Cowardice dressed in fine clothes was still cowardice. Leopold turned to his son, his face a mixture of rage and helplessness. Alexander, I'm sorry. That boy's a plague upon decent society. It's nothing I haven't heard before, father. Alexander resumed walking, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. Maximilian is just more eloquent in his cruelty than most. They continued their walk in heavy silence, but Alexander's mind was elsewhere. He thought of the piano waiting in their music room, the one place where his hands unmarred and graceful could speak a beauty his face could not. Music was his refuge, the language where he was fluent and admired. At the keyboard the scar disappeared. Only the notes mattered, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across Stat Park. Casting long fingers of darkness between the golden lamplight, Alexander made a decision. He would attend the imperial gathering at Heldenplatz next week. Not because he wanted to face society's judgment again, but because hiding would be the same as accepting their verdict. He was Alexander von Rothenburg, heir to a noble house, a pianist of remarkable skill, and a young man who had once been brave enough to run into fire. The scar was part of his story, not the whole of it, if Vienna refused to see that the failure was theirs, not his. But as their carriage rolled back toward home through the gaslit streets, Alexander couldn't shake the memory of Maximilian's eyes. That flash of something beyond simple cruelty. It unsettled him more than the insults ever could, because he couldn't name it or understand it. In the complex social chess game of Viennese aristocracy, Maximilian von Steinhardt was a player whose moves Alexander could not predict. And that, he sensed, made him dangerous in ways that went beyond mere words. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparation and mounting anxiety. Alexander spent hours at the piano, his fingers dancing across ivory keys as Chopin and Liszt flowed from his soul through the instrument. His mother, Baroness Helena von Rothenburg, fussed over his wardrobe for the Heldenplatz gathering with an attention to detail that betrayed her own nervousness. The black casaca with the silver brocade vest, she insisted, holding the garments up to the light streaming through their residence's tall windows. At 45, she remained beautiful. Though worry had etched fine lines around her eyes, worry for her only child, the son she loved fiercely but could not protect from the world's cruelty. Mother, it hardly matters what I wear, Alexander said gently from the piano bench. They won't be looking at my clothing. Helena's hands stilled on the fabric. She crossed to him, cupping his face in her hands, both sides, scarred and unscarred alike. You are beautiful, Alexander. Not despite your mark, but with it. It speaks of who you are, brave, selfless, willing to act when others would hesitate. I wish society valued those qualities as much as you do. Society is a fickle mistress, she replied, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. But she can be won over. You simply need the right moment, the right stage. Alexander doubted any stage existed where his scar would be seen as anything but a defect, but he kept that thought to himself. His mother needed hope, even if he could not share it. The day of the Heldenplatz gathering arrived with cruel perfection. The weather was clear and bright, offering no excuse for cancellation. The massive plaza stretched before the Hofburg Imperial Palace, its geometric cobblestone patterns creating a visual symphony of precision and order. Monumental equestrian statues cast long shadows across the square, where hundreds of Vienna's elite had gathered for an outdoor reception honoring a visiting delegation from the German Empire. Military bands played precise marches as aristocrats in their finest attire circulated like pieces on an elaborate game board. Women in voluminous dresses with bustles created colorful islands of fabric, while men in frock coats and top hats negotiated alliances and social standing through carefully choreographed conversations. Alexander arrived with his parents, immediately feeling the weight of attention. Whispers followed him like a wake behind a ship. He kept his posture military straight, his expression carefully neutral as he'd been trained since childhood. A count's son must never show weakness, never betray hurt, never acknowledge the cruelty of lesser minds. Alexander, a familiar voice called. It was Johann, one of the few young aristocrats who treated him with genuine kindness. The earnest young baron approached with a warm smile. I was hoping you'd attend. The musical program this afternoon is supposed to be exceptional. They have a virtuoso from Prague performing Beethoven. Johann, good to see you. Alexander felt some of his tension ease. I'd heard about the performance. Which sonata? The Pathetique, I believe. You should offer to play something yourself. You put the professionals to shame. Before Alexander could respond, a commotion near the center of the plaza drew their attention. A crowd was forming, and at its center stood Maximilian von Steinhardt, resplendent in a burgundy frock coat with gold buttons, his platinum hair gleaming in the sunlight. He was holding court, his voice carrying across the cobblestones. And I told the Archduke that true nobility shows itself in every aspect of a man. His bearing, his appearance, his worthiness to represent his family name. Maximilian's gaze swept the crowd, and landed on Alexander with the precision of a predator spotting prey. Speaking of representation, here comes an interesting case study. Alexander felt his father tense beside him, but Leopold's hand on his arm counseled patience. They could not make a scene at an imperial gathering. Maximilian began walking toward them, his entourage and a growing crowd following like a comet's tail. Young Rothenburg. I was just discussing the nature of nobility. Tell me, do you think a man's external appearance reflects his internal worth? Or can a, shall we say, marred exterior hide a pure soul? The crowd around them had grown to perhaps 50 people, all watching with the hungry fascination of Romans at the Colosseum. Alexander recognized many faces, some sympathetic, others merely curious, and more than a few eager for drama. I believe, Alexander said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, that only a shallow mind judges worth by appearances alone. True nobility is measured in actions, in character, in how one treats those with less power than oneself. How philosophical. Maximilian clapped his hands together mockingly. But you see, that's the luxury of ugly people, isn't it? They must convince themselves that beauty doesn't matter because they cannot possess it. Meanwhile, the rest of us understand that God or nature or whatever power you believe in shows favor through physical perfection. Look around you. Do you see any scarred faces among Vienna's finest families? No, because excellence breeds excellence. And double quotes Maximilian, that's quite enough. This new voice was deep, commanding, and carried absolute authority. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and through the gap strode a man who needed no introduction. Duke Friedrich von Steinhardt, Maximilian's father, was one of the most powerful men in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At 52, he carried himself with military precision, his broad shoulders draped in a decorated uniform that proclaimed his rank and achievements. His graying hair and full mustache were impeccably groomed, and his blue eyes, so like his son's but weighted with experience and something harder, surveyed the scene with evident displeasure. Father. Maximilian's arrogance flickered for just a moment. I was merely engaging in philosophical discourse. You were making a spectacle. The Duke's voice could have frozen the Danube. His gaze moved to Alexander, and something strange happened. The Duke's expression, so stern and controlled, suddenly shifted. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and color drained from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. The Duke stared at Alexander, not at the scar, but at his eyes. Those penetrating green eyes that were his mother's legacy. The Duke's lips parted slightly, and for a long moment the powerful man seemed frozen, paralyzed by recognition or memory or something that transcended the present moment. You, the Duke whispered so quietly that only those nearest could hear. His hand, which had been resting on his ceremonial sword, began to tremble. Those eyes. That mark, the plaza seemed to hold its breath. Maximilian looked between his father and Alexander, confusion replacing his usual smugness. Leopold stepped forward protectively, unsure what was happening but sensing danger. Duke Steinhardt, Leopold said carefully. Is something wrong? The Duke didn't respond immediately. He continued staring at Alexander as if seeing through him, through time itself, to something long buried. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion barely contained. What is your mother's maiden name, boy? The question was so unexpected, so oddly personal, that Alexander hesitated. Von Oldenburg, your grace. Baroness Helena von Oldenburg, before her marriage to my father. The Duke's eyes closed, and he seemed to sway slightly. When they opened again, they glistened with what might have been tears, an impossible sight on such a man. Helena, he breathed. Dear God, Helena. Father, what is this about? Maximilian demanded, his perfect composure cracking. Who is this Helena? The Duke ignored his son, taking a step toward Alexander. His gaze moved to the scar, and his trembling hand reached out as if to touch it, then stopped, hovering in the air. The fire. You were in a fire. When? 12 years ago, your grace, Alexander replied, completely bewildered. I was 7, the Duke repeated, and now a tear did escape, running down his weathered cheek. The crowd around them had gone absolutely silent, sensing they were witnessing something momentous but unable to comprehend it. You would have been 7, the timing. It matches. Leopold moved to stand beside his son, confusion and a growing sense of dread warring in his expression. Duke Steinhardt, I must ask what this is about. You're frightening my son. The Duke finally tore his gaze from Alexandra to look at Leopold. What passed between them in that look was profound. A question asked and recognized, even if not yet answered. Count Rothenburg, I wonder, might we speak privately? You, your wife, myself, and Alexander. I don't understand, Leopold began. Please, the Duke interrupted, and the word held such weight, such desperate urgency, that it transcended his usual authority. There are things that must be said, things that have been hidden for too long. Secrets that... He looked back at Alexander and his voice broke. Secrets that have a right to be known. The crowd erupted in whispers, speculation running wild. Maximilian stood frozen, his perfect face a mask of incomprehension and growing horror as he began to piece together implications too terrible to voice. Alexander felt the world tilting beneath his feet. The scar on his face seemed to burn as it had on that day 12 years ago. But this was a different kind of fire, the heat of truth long buried, of questions never asked, of a life that might not be what he'd always believed it to be. Your Grace, Alexander heard himself say, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. What are you saying? Duke Friedrich von Steinhardt, one of the most powerful men in the empire, looked at the scarred young man before him with an expression of wonder, grief, and something that looked remarkably like love. I'm saying, Alexander, that 19 years ago, I knew a woman named Helena von Oldenburg. I knew her very well, and I have spent nearly 2 decades believing that what we created together was lost forever. The implications hung in the air like the sword of Damocles. Leopold's face went white. Maximilian made a strangled sound of disbelief, and Alexander simply stared at the Duke, at those blue eyes that were suddenly so familiar, the face that bore no resemblance to his own except in one crucial detail, the shape of the jaw, the set of the mouth when not speaking. No, Alexander whispered. That's not, it can't be, but even as he denied it, pieces were falling into place. His mother's sadness when she looked at him sometimes, a melancholy that went beyond concern for his scar. His father, Leopold, the man who'd raised him, treating him with a gentleness that now seemed tinged with something else. Something like the love of a man who'd chosen to love a child that wasn't his blood, chosen it freely and completely. We need to speak, the Duke said again, his voice steadier now, though his eyes remained locked on Alexander. Away from here. There's a story you deserve to hear, one I never thought I'd have the chance to tell. The gathering at Heldenplatz had been meant to celebrate diplomatic relations. Instead, it had become the stage for a revelation that would shake 2 families and challenge everything Alexander had believed about himself. As the Duke gestured toward the carriages, as Leopold stood pale and silent beside him, as Maximilian stared in horror at the boy he'd tormented, his half-brother Alexander touched his scar, this mark that had defined how the world saw him, that had brought him such pain, had also been the key to unlocking a truth buried for 19 years. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or terrified. Perhaps both. Perhaps something entirely new that he had no name for yet. The autumn sun continued to shine down on Heldenplatz's cobblestones, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in its light. History was being written in whispers and tears and stunned silences. And Alexander von Rothenburg, or whoever he truly was, stood at the center of it, his scarred face turned toward an uncertain future. The private salon at the Steinhardt Palace was a masterpiece of imperial design. Rich mahogany panels lined the walls, interrupted by paintings from the Italian Renaissance. Crystal chandeliers refracted afternoon light into rainbow patterns across Persian carpets. It was a room designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of the power and wealth of the Steinhardt family. Today it felt like a confessional. Alexander sat rigidly in a Baroque chair, his parents, both of them, he supposed, on either side. His mother, Helena, had arrived shortly after the summons, her face already streaked with tears before anyone had spoken a word. Leopold held her hand, and the tenderness in that gesture told Alexander more than any explanation could. Duke Friedrich stood by the tall windows, his back to them, staring out at the manicured gardens below. He'd removed his military jacket, and in his shirt sleeves he seemed less the powerful duke and more a man bearing the weight of old sins. I met your mother at a summer ball in 1865, the Duke began, his voice low. She was 18, freshly presented to society, the most beautiful creature I'd ever seen. Those green eyes... He turned slightly, glancing at Alexander. Your eyes. Helena's sob was soft but audible. Leopold squeezed her hand tighter. "We were in love," the Duke continued, turning back to the window. "Genuinely, desperately in love. But I was already engaged in an arrangement made by my father years before, to a woman who would bring substantial political alliances. Your mother was from a good family, but not one that could offer what my future wife's connections provided. So you abandoned her," Alexander said, the words coming out harder than he intended. "I didn't know," the Duke said quickly, turning to face them fully now. "I swear to you, Alexander, I didn't know she was pregnant. Helena disappeared from society that winter. I was told she'd gone abroad for her health. I married my intended in the spring, and by summer Helena had returned to Vienna, married to Count Leopold von Rothenburg." Alexander looked at the man he'd always called father. Leopold met his gaze steadily, his brown eyes full of love and a painful honesty. "Your mother came to me with the truth," Leopold said quietly. "We'd been friends since childhood. She was desperate, frightened, facing ruin. I loved her then, I love her still. Not as the Duke had, perhaps, but deeply nonetheless. I offered her a solution: marriage, legitimacy for her child, a future. You saved us," Helena whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved us when we had nothing, when I had nothing. I gained everything," Leopold corrected gently. "A wife I cherished and a son who has brought me nothing but pride." He reached across to touch Alexander's hand. "Blood doesn't make a father, Alexander. Love does. Choice does. And I chose you from the moment I first held you." Alexander felt tears burning his eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not yet. There was still too much to understand. "And the Duke? You knew about him?" "I knew there had been someone," Leopold admitted. "Helena told me she'd loved a man who couldn't marry her. She never revealed his name. I never asked. It seemed kinder not to know." The Duke moved closer, his imposing frame seeming diminished somehow. "For 19 years I believed you were gone. There was a rumor, after Helena married, that she'd lost a child in pregnancy. I mourned what I thought we'd created together, what I'd lost through my own cowardice." His voice strengthened. "But you lived. You lived, and you became this remarkable young man, and I was blind to it because I was looking at the surface, judging by appearance just as my son does." "Your son," Alexander said bitterly. "Maximilian. My half-brother." The Duke flinched as if struck. "The irony's not lost on me. I raised him with every advantage, gave him everything except the lessons that truly matter. He became a mirror of my own worst qualities, my arrogance, my superficiality, my cowardice." He knelt before Alexander, this powerful Duke on his knees. "While you, raised by a truly noble man, became everything I should have taught Maximilian to be." Alexander stared down at this stranger who was his blood father. The man's blue eyes, Maximilian's eyes, were wet with tears. "Why now?" Alexander asked. "Why reveal yourself now?" "The scar," the Duke said simply. "When I saw it and those eyes together, I was thrown back 19 years to when I last held your mother. She told me then that if we ever had a child, she hoped it would have her eyes and my determination. Looking at you today, I saw both. And the scar. Helena, you said there was a fire?" Helena nodded through her tears. "Alexander was 7. He ran into the burning stable to save his horse. We tried to stop him, but he was so determined, so brave. The beam fell, ... My determination," the Duke whispered. Quote, "My stubbornness, which I have used for politics and power, you used to save a life. Even at 7, you were more the man I should be than I've ever been." He looked up at Alexander with raw emotion. "I saw you being humiliated by my son, my other son, and I saw the injustice of it. How the boy I raised tormented the boy I abandoned. How nobility of birth had produced cruelty, while nobility of character was being punished for it." The room fell silent except for Helena's quiet weeping. Alexander's mind reeled with the weight of it all. His entire life recontextualized in minutes. The loving father who wasn't his blood but chose him anyway. The powerful stranger who was his blood but hadn't known him. The half-brother who'd tortured him out of instincts they apparently shared, the worst of the Duke's legacy. "What happens now?" Alexander finally asked. The Duke rose, wiping his eyes with no shame. "That depends on what you want, what you need. Legally, you are Alexander von Rothenburg, Leopold's heir. That doesn't change, but ... He hesitated. "I would like to know you, if you'll permit it. Not as a father who forfeited that right, but perhaps as someone who cares for your well-being. Who can offer support, connections, opportunities in Maximilian?" Alexander asked. "Does he know? Not yet. But he must be told." The Duke's jaw set firmly. "And he must be taught what I failed to teach him. That true worth has nothing to do with appearance, and everything to do with character." You, Alexander, will be his teacher in this, whether he knows it or not. Leopold spoke for the first time in several minutes. This is overwhelming for Alexander. Perhaps we should continue this discussion another day, give everyone time to... No, Alexander interrupted, surprising himself. He stood, facing the Duke directly. I need to know something, Your Grace. If you had known about me from the beginning, would you have chosen differently? Would you have chosen my mother and me over your political marriage? The Duke met his gaze unflinchingly. I want to say yes. I want to tell you I would have sacrificed everything for love. But I was young, ambitious, and a coward. I likely would have made the same choice. He paused. But I will tell you this. I regret it. Every day since I lost your mother, I've regretted it. And now, knowing what that choice cost me, knowing you exist, and that I missed every moment of your life, the regret is unbearable. It was an honest answer, at least. Alexander appreciated that. I need time, he said finally. Time to understand what this means, who I am now with this knowledge. Of course, the Duke said immediately. Take all the time you need. I've waited 19 years. I can wait longer. Helena stood, moving to Alexander and taking his hands. My darling boy, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to find out this way in public with such shock. I'd hoped. I don't know what I hoped. That it would never matter, perhaps. Alexander looked down at his mother's beautiful face, still lovely, despite the tears and years. Did you love him? He nodded toward the Duke. Truly, with all my heart, she whispered. But I love your father, Tuli, all differently, but no less deeply. He gave me a life when mine was destroyed. He loved you before you were born and every day since. Alexander turned to Leopold. This man who'd read him bedtime stories, taught him to ride, supported his musical passions, defended him against cruelty. Father, he said, and Leopold's face crumpled with relief at the word. You are my father. Nothing changes that. They embraced, and Alexander felt Leopold's tears against his shoulder. Over his father's shoulder he saw the Duke watching with an expression of profound loss and acceptance. The man had gained a son today, but would never truly be a father. That role was filled, had been filled with love and dedication for 19 years. When they separated, Alexander addressed the Duke once more. I will consider your offer of acquaintance, Your Grace, but I make no promises. You have much to prove and much to answer for with Maximilian. I understand, the Duke said. And Alexander, thank you. For existing, for becoming who you are despite everything. You are proof that nobility is earned, not inherited. As the Rothenburg family prepared to leave, Alexander paused at the door. The humiliations, he said to the Duke. Maximilian's cruelty toward me. It wasn't random, was it? He sensed something, some threat I represented without either of us knowing why. The Duke considered this. Perhaps. Instinct sometimes knows what the mind cannot see. He may have sensed a rival, a brother who possessed what he lacked in character. A sad smile crossed his face. Or perhaps he was simply cruel, and I failed as a father long before today's revelations. Alexander nodded slowly. Then you have 2 sons to reckon with, Your Grace. One you must come to know, and one you must teach to be better than he is. I wish you luck with both tasks. With that, Alexander left the Steinhardt Palace, walking out into the late afternoon light between his mother and the father who'd chosen him. Behind them, the Duke stood alone in his magnificent salon, surrounded by wealth and power that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to what he'd lost and found again in the scarred face of a remarkable young man. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of chestnuts roasting from street vendors. Vienna continued its elegant dance, unaware that in one of its grandest palaces, the foundations of 2 families had shifted forever. 3 weeks passed before Alexander saw Maximilian again. The encounter happened at the Naschmarkt, Vienna's vibrant outdoor marketplace where the aristocracy occasionally mingled with common folk in search of exotic spices or rare delicacies. Alexander was there with Johann, seeking sheet music from a vendor who imported compositions from Paris. He sensed Maximilian's presence before he saw him, a ripple of recognition that was new, this awareness of shared blood. When he turned, his half-brother stood 20 paces away, staring at him with an expression Alexander had never seen before. Uncertainty. Gone was the smug superiority, the cruel confidence. Maximilian looked as if the ground beneath his perfect boots had turned to quicksand. He was alone, without his usual entourage of admirers. They stood that way for a long moment, the marketplace flowing around them, vendors calling their wares, the scent of cardamom and coffee mixing in the air, the babble of a dozen languages from the Austro-Hungarian Empire's diverse population, 2 half-brothers, strangers bound by blood and circumstance. Finally, Maximilian approached. His steps were hesitant, and Alexander noticed details he'd never seen before, the slight tremor in those aristocratic hands, the shadows under the ice-blue eyes that suggested sleepless nights. Alexander, Maximilian said, and the name sounded strange in his mouth, not mocking, not cruel, just uncertain. Maximilian. Johann looked between them, sensing the tension, and quietly excused himself to examine some violin strings at a nearby stall. Double quotes, Maximilian began, then stopped. Words seemed to fail him, this young man who'd always wielded them like weapons. Father told me. Everything. I assumed he would. I didn't know, Maximilian said quickly. When I said those things, when I when I tormented you, I didn't know we were double quotes brothers, Alexander supplied. Brothers. Maximilian flinched as if the word had struck him. Yes, that. He looked down at the cobblestones, then back up, and Alexander saw something in those blue eyes he'd never expected. Shame. It doesn't excuse what I did, what I've been doing for years, but I need you to know I didn't know. Would it have mattered? Alexander asked, genuinely curious. If you had known, would you have treated me differently? The question hung between them. Maximilian's jaw worked as if chewing on honesty that tasted bitter. I don't know, he admitted finally. I'd like to think yes. But Father says I've been cruel because I'm empty inside. That I judge others by their appearance because I have nothing else to offer. And do you agree with him? I don't know what I am anymore, Maximilian said, and the vulnerability in his voice was startling. My entire life I'd been the Duke's perfect son, the heir to one of the Empire's greatest houses. Beautiful, accomplished, superior. He laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Then I discover that my father's true pride, the son who embodies everything he values, is the one I've been destroying. The scarred boy I called a monster is my brother, a better man than I'll ever be. Alexander studied him carefully. This could be manipulation, another form of cruelty disguised as contrition. But the slump of Maximilian's shoulders, the genuine confusion in his eyes, suggested otherwise. You're not your father, Alexander said finally. And I'm not mine, not Leopold, not the Duke. We're ourselves. Shaped by them, but not defined by them. How can you be so calm about this? Maximilian asked, genuine bewilderment crossing his features. I've spent years making your life miserable. I've humiliated you publicly, mocked your appearance, tried to make you feel worthless. And now you stand here speaking to me as if we're equals. We are equals, Alexander said simply. We always were. You just couldn't see it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Your cruelty hurt me, Maximilian, deeply. But I also understand it, not unexcuse it, but understand it. You were raised to believe that perfection was everything, that appearance determined worth. The Duke gave you wealth and position, but forgot to give you substance. That's not entirely your fault. Maximilian's eyes glistened with what might have been tears. You're generous to say so. I'm honest, not generous. There's a difference. Alexander adjusted the sheet music under his arm. But I will say this, what you do from this moment forward is entirely your choice. You can continue being the man you've been, or you can choose to become someone different, someone better. I don't know how, Maximilian admitted, and the confession seemed to cost him dearly. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. Alexander considered this, then made a decision that surprised even himself. Come to our house tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. What? Why? Because I'm going to teach you something, Alexander said. Something that has nothing to do with appearances or social standing or any of the things you think matter. Maximilian looked suspicious. What could you possibly teach me? Music, Alexander replied. I'm going to teach you to play the piano. I don't understand. What does music have to? It has everything to do with it, Alexander interrupted. Music is the one place where appearance means nothing, where the beauty comes from within, from skill and passion and dedication, where a scarred hand can create something perfect. He met Maximilian's gaze steadily. If you want to understand what the Duke sees in me, what he wishes he'd taught you, start there. Learn to create beauty instead of destroying it. Maximilian stood silent for a long moment, processing this unexpected offer. Around them the market continued its chaotic dance, a woman haggling over the price of silk, children laughing as they chased a stray cat, the smell of fresh bread wafting from a nearby bakery. Life in all its messy, imperfect beauty. All right, Maximilian said finally. Tomorrow. 3 o'clock. He hesitated, then added, Thank you, Alexander, for giving me a chance I don't deserve. Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were, Alexander replied. Even you. As Maximilian walked away, his perfect posture slightly less rigid than before, Johann returned with a knowing smile. That was remarkably kind of you. Was it kindness? Alexander wondered aloud. Or just pragmatism? He's my half-brother. We're bound together now, whether we like it or not. Better to have him as an ally than an enemy. I think it was kindness, Johann insisted. Pragmatic kindness, perhaps, but kindness nonetheless. He paused. You're different, you know. Since the revelation, more confident. Alexander thought about this. His friend was right. Something had shifted inside him when the truth came to light. The scar that had defined him for so long had become the key to understanding his true identity. And in that understanding, he'd found a strange liberation. I know who I am now, he said. Not just who people see when they look at me, but who I actually am. The son of a woman who loved bravely and foolishly. The son of a man who chose love over blood. The product of a duke's passion and a count's compassion. He touched his scar lightly. And someone who survived fire, literally and metaphorically. And Maximilian? Do you really think you can change him? I don't know if anyone can change another person, Alexander admitted. But I can give him the tools to change himself. What he does with them is his choice. The next afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, a carriage bearing the Steinhardt crest arrived at the Rothenburg residence. Maximilian emerged, dressed more simply than Alexander had ever seen him, a plain dark suit without the usual ostentation. He looked nervous. Helena greeted him at the door with a complicated expression. This was her lover's son, her own son's tormentor, and now, family of a sort. Maximilian, she said carefully. Alexander is waiting in the music room. Thank you, Baroness, Maximilian replied, and his usual arrogance was noticeably absent. The music room was Alexander's sanctuary. A grand piano dominated the space, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Shelves lined with sheet music and books on musical theory created a fortress of culture. It was here that Alexander felt most himself, most free. Maximilian entered hesitantly, looking around with what might have been envy. I've never spent much time with music, he admitted. Father always emphasized military training, politics, social graces. Then we start from the beginning, Alexander said, gesturing to the piano bench. Sit. They sat side by side, and Alexander was struck by the strangeness of it. Two half-brothers. One scarred and one perfect, sharing a bench where beauty would be measured only by sound. Music, Alexander began, is about vulnerability. It requires you to feel deeply and express those feelings honestly. No masks, no pretense. That sounds terrifying, Maximilian said, attempting levity but sounding genuinely anxious. It is, Alexander agreed. But it's also freeing. He placed Maximilian's hands on the keys, adjusting his fingers to the proper position. This is middle C. Every complex piece begins with simple notes. Just like every person, no matter how they appear on the surface, is built from simple elements, hopes, fears, dreams, regrets. For the next hour, Alexander taught Maximilian the basics. Scales at first, then simple melodies. Maximilian's fingers were clumsy, his frustration evident when he struck wrong notes. But gradually something shifted. As he focused on the music, his usual veneer of superiority fell away. He became simply a student, struggling with something new, vulnerable in his incompetence. I'm terrible at this, Maximilian said, laughing with surprising, genuine humor. I've never been terrible at anything before. Then this is good for you, Alexander replied. Humility is a lesson you've needed. They worked until the light began to fade, and by the end, Maximilian could play a simple folk melody, haltingly, imperfectly, but recognizably. When he finished, he stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. I created something, he said wonderingly. Something that wasn't about how I look or who my father is, just ... Something beautiful. That's the point, Alexander said. You have the capacity for creation, not just destruction. You just never learned to use it. Maximilian turned to face him, and his ice-blue eyes held a new depth. Why are you doing this, Alexander? Really? After everything I've done to you, why help me? Alexander considered the question carefully. Because the Duke, our father, asked me to teach you what he couldn't. But also because ... double quotes, he paused, searching for the right words. Because I understand now that cruelty often comes from pain. You've been in pain your whole life, Maximilian, even if you didn't recognize it. The pain of trying to be perfect, of believing your worth depends on maintaining an impossible standard. I've been in pain too, from the cruelty directed at my imperfections. Maybe we can both heal. Tears spilled down Maximilian's perfect cheeks, and he didn't wipe them away. I'm sorry, he whispered, for all of it. Every cruel word, every humiliation, every moment I made you feel less than you are. I'm sorry, Alexander. It was the first genuine apology Alexander had ever received from anyone who tormented him for his appearance. He felt something release inside him, a knot of pain he'd carried for years beginning to loosen. I accept your apology, he said, but you have to mean it. You have to actually change. I want to, Maximilian said fervently. I don't want to be the man I've been, the empty, cruel man father described. I want to be worthy of being your brother. Alexander felt tears prick his own eyes. He'd never imagined this Maximilian vulnerable, honest, seeking redemption. Then keep coming back, he said, every week. We'll work on music, and in the process, maybe we'll work on becoming better men. Both of us. Both of us? I have my own lessons to learn, Alexander admitted. Forgiveness, trust, letting go of bitterness. This will help me as much as it helps you. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled over Vienna outside. Inside the music room, two half-brothers found an unexpected harmony, not in their blood or their shared father, but in the recognition that they were both imperfect, both struggling, both capable of becoming something better than they'd been. The weeks that followed brought a transformation that Vienna's high society watched with fascination and confusion. Maximilian von Steinhardt, once the epitome of cruel perfection, began appearing regularly at the Rothenburg residence. Rumors flew, some scandalous, others closer to the truth. The Duke, for his part, said nothing publicly, but those close to him noticed a change. He seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been lifted. Leopold observed the growing relationship between the half-brothers with a mixture of pride and melancholy. One evening, as he and Helena sat in their drawing room, he voiced his fears. I'm losing him, he said quietly. Not all at once, but gradually. The Duke can offer him so much more than I can: connections, wealth, opportunities. Helena took his hand gently. You could never lose Alexander. You are his father in every way that matters. Blood doesn't change that. But the Duke is his blood. And Maximilian, despite everything, is his brother. And you are the man who chose to love him when you had no obligation to do so, Helena replied firmly. That love, that choice, is worth more than any amount of shared blood. Alexander knows that. As if summoned by their conversation, Alexander appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. Father, mother, may I speak with you? They made room for him on the settee, and Alexander sat between them, these two people who'd shaped his life with their impossible choices and unconditional love. The Duke has made me an offer, he began. He wants to formally acknowledge me as his son. Not replace father, he added quickly, seeing Leopold's face pale, but acknowledge the truth publicly. He says it would give me access to opportunities, connections, a future beyond what the Rothenburg name can provide. What did you tell him? Leopold asked, his voice carefully neutral. That I needed to discuss it with you first, Alexander replied, because any decision I make affects all of us. He turned to Leopold. Father, you've given me everything. Your name, your love, your protection. I don't want you to think that accepting the Duke's acknowledgement means I'm rejecting what you've given me. Leopold's eyes glistened with tears. Alexander, my greatest wish has always been for you to have every opportunity in life. If the Duke's acknowledgement can give you that, then you have my blessing. But it will cause scandal, Alexander protested. People will talk. They'll say terrible things about Mother, about you, about all of us. People already talked, Helena said with a sad smile. They've talked about your scar for years. Let them talk about the truth for a change. At least this talk will be based in reality, and it might do some good, Leopold added thoughtfully. If Vienna's society sees the Duke, one of their most powerful members, acknowledge a son marked by scars, publicly declaring his worth despite his appearance, it could change how others are perceived. Your struggle could help others who face similar judgment. Alexander hadn't considered this. His pain, his humiliation, transformed into something that might benefit others. You really wouldn't mind? He asked Leopold. Sharing me with him? Leopold pulled his son into an embrace. I've never possessed you, Alexander. I've only loved you. And love isn't diminished by being shared. It's multiplied. He pulled back to look at Alexander's face. You have enough heart for two fathers. I've known that since you were old enough to show compassion to every injured creature you found, every servant who needed kindness, every person society overlooked. 3 days later, Duke Friedrich von Steinhardt made a public announcement that sent shockwaves through Viennese society. At a formal gathering in the Hofburg Palace, with the aristocracy assembled in all their finery, he stood and spoke with clear, unwavering authority. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a confession to make. 19 years ago, I failed in my duty to honor and truth. I allowed fear and ambition to override love and responsibility. His gaze swept the crowd, silencing whispers with his intensity. I've recently discovered that I have a son I never knew, a young man of remarkable character and exceptional talent. Alexander von Rothenburg is my son by blood, raised by the noble Count Leopold as his own, and I formally acknowledge him as such before all of you today." The gasps and murmurs rose like a wave. The Duke raised his hand for silence. "I know this revelation causes shock and no doubt scandal, but I make this declaration for one reason. Alexander deserves the truth, and the truth deserves to be spoken. He bears a scar on his face from an act of courage in childhood. That scar has caused him to be judged, mocked, and rejected by a society that claims to value nobility but often recognizes only beauty." He paused, his eyes finding Alexander in the crowd standing beside Leopold and Helena. "My son, both my sons have taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with appearance. Alexander, scarred and rejected, possesses more genuine worth than most in this room, while my other son, Maximilian, born with every advantage including physical perfection, had to learn from his scarred brother what it means to have real character." Maximilian stood at his father's side, and to everyone's surprise he stepped forward. "My father speaks truly," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned assembly. "I've spent years mocking Alexander von Rothenburg for his scar. I called him monster, made him suffer, tried to diminish him because I felt diminished by my own emptiness. He looked directly at Alexander, but he is twice the man I am. He has shown me mercy I didn't deserve, offered me friendship I hadn't earned, and taught me that creation is more valuable than destruction. He is my brother, and I am proud to claim him as such." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Johann, Alexander's loyal friend, stood and applauded. Others joined slowly, first those who'd secretly sympathized with Alexander, then those who respected the Duke's courage, and finally even those who'd participated in the cruelty, shamed by the public confession into acknowledgement. Alexander stood, overwhelmed by the moment. Leopold squeezed his shoulder, and Helena wiped tears from her eyes. The Duke descended from the dais and walked to where they stood, this impossible, complicated family bound by secrets and revelations. "Alexander," the Duke said, "I cannot give you back the years I missed. I cannot erase the pain my absence and my son's cruelty caused you. But I can give you this: my name, my resources, and my commitment to ensuring that no one in Vienna or beyond ever again mistakes a scarred face for a damaged soul." Alexander looked at this man who was his father but would never be his father. That role belonged to Leopold. He looked at Maximilian, who'd transformed from tormentor to brother through music and vulnerability. He looked at his parents, who'd built their lives on a loving deception that had just been stripped away in public. "Your Grace," Alexander said formally, then corrected himself. "Father Friedrich." The name felt strange on his tongue, but not wrong. "I accept your acknowledgement, not because I need your name or your wealth, but because the truth deserves to be spoken, as you said, and because perhaps our story can help others understand that worth isn't measured in unblemished skin or perfect features." He stepped forward and extended his hand, the hand that created beautiful music that bore no scars unlike his face. The Duke took it, then pulled Alexander into an embrace that was 19 years overdue. The assembled aristocracy watched as the Duke held his newly acknowledged son. As Maximilian joined the embrace with tears streaming down his perfect face, as Leopold and Helena stood nearby with expressions of bittersweet joy. It was messy and complicated and imperfect, just like the people involved. But it was also honest. And in Vienna's glittering society, where appearances meant everything and truth was often sacrificed for propriety, that honesty was revolutionary. 6 months later, the Musikverein concert hall glowed with the light of 1,000 candles. Vienna's finest had gathered for a special performance, a piano concert featuring 2 unexpected performers. The program had created enormous buzz. Alexander von Rothenburg Steinhardt and Maximilian von Steinhardt, half-brothers, performing together for the first time publicly. Backstage, Alexander adjusted his formal tailcoat, while Maximilian paced nervously. The older brother's confidence had grown in recent months, but public performance still terrified him. "You'll be fine," Alexander assured him. "Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about the feeling behind the notes." "Easy for you to say," Maximilian replied, but he was smiling. "You've been doing this for years. I've only been playing for 6 months. And you've learned more in 6 months than most do in years," Alexander countered. "Because you've finally learned how to be vulnerable." The Duke appeared, resplendent in his formal uniform, decorations gleaming. Behind him came Leopold, elegant in his count's attire. The two fathers had reached an understanding, an awkward but functional peace built on their shared love for Alexander. "Ready, boys?" the Duke asked, and the casual address made both young men smile. He'd been working to be less formal, more present with both his sons. "As ready as we'll ever be," Maximilian said. Leopold approached Alexander, straightening his collar with the familiar gesture of a father. Your mother is in the front row. She's already crying and you haven't even started playing yet. Alexander laughed. That sounds like mother. She's proud of you, Leopold continued. We both are. Not just for your music, but for who you've become. For your capacity to forgive, to teach, to transform pain into something beautiful. I learned that from you, Alexander said softly. You transformed mother's pain and shame into a family. You showed me that love can redeem anything. The stage manager appeared. 5 minutes, gentlemen. As they prepared to go on stage, Maximilian grabbed Alexander's arm. Thank you, he said urgently. For everything. For seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. We saved each other, Alexander replied. You gave me a family I didn't know I needed. A brother, a father, a new understanding of myself. They walked out onto the stage together and the audience erupted in applause. Alexander saw his mother in the front row, tears already streaming down her beautiful face. Beside her sat Leopold, pride evident in every line of his expression. The Duke sat at the end of the row, his usual stern demeanor softened by something that looked remarkably like contentment. The brothers sat at the piano, Alexander's familiar territory, Maximilian's new world. They would perform a duet Alexander had arranged, a piece that required them to work in perfect synchronization, each complementing the other's strengths and covering for their weaknesses. As Alexander's scarred hands and Maximilian's perfect ones hovered over the keys, preparing for the first notes, Alexander thought about the journey that had brought them here. A cruel encounter in a park, a public humiliation, a duke paralyzed by recognition, and a truth that had been buried for 19 years. Pain and revelation, cruelty and redemption, secrets and honesty, all woven together like the complex harmonies of the music they were about to create. The scar on his face caught the candlelight as he turned slightly, and for once he didn't think of it as a mark of shame or courage. It was simply part of his story, the key that had unlocked everything, the imperfection that had led to truth. They began to play, and the music that filled the Musikverein was more than just notes on a page. It was the sound of two brothers finding harmony despite their differences, of fathers learning to share a son, of a mother's love vindicated, of a society challenged to look beyond surfaces to see the substance beneath. It was the sound of wounds healing, of cruelty transformed into compassion, of appearance finally surrendering to the greater truth of character. It was imperfect and human and honest and therefore truly beautiful. As the final notes faded and the audience rose in thunderous applause, Alexander looked at his brother and saw tears on Maximilian's face, not of shame or pain, but of joy. The perfect son had learned to be human, and the scarred son had learned he was whole. In the front row, two fathers applauded their shared son, and a mother wept for the family that scandal and secrets and courage had built. Vienna's highest society watched as nobility was redefined not by bloodlines or appearance, but by the courage to be honest, to change, to love despite the cost. The scar that had marked Alexander von Rothenburg as different had become his greatest gift, the flaw that revealed the cracks in society's facade. The imperfection that proved perfect beauty was hollow without substance, the wound that in healing had healed others. And as the brothers stood to acknowledge the applause, hands clasped between them in brotherhood earned rather than merely inherited, the audience understood they were witnessing something more than a concert. They were witnessing transformation itself, the proof that anyone, no matter how scarred or how perfect, could choose to become better than they were. The music had ended, but the harmony they'd found would continue. Imperfect and precious and real, resonating far beyond the golden walls of the Musikverein into the lives of everyone who'd witnessed that truth. That worth is measured not in unblemished faces, but in brave hearts willing to create beauty from pain, to offer mercy when cruelty would be easier, and to believe that redemption is always possible. Even in Imperial Vienna, where appearance had always been everything, two brothers proved that sometimes the most beautiful thing of all is simply being honest about who you are, scars, flaws, and all.